I think I just wanted to say a few words of welcome to Mabel, who's going to say a few words of welcome to her guests. And I'm not going to talk about the book at all, really, since that's the purpose of the evening, which is I think that the guests are being challenged or whatever by the writer of the book, as if to see if they've done their homework. And I think it's going to be a wonderful evening. And the only thing I wanted to say is of course, just to mark our affection and respect for Mabel, and a small observation, which is that we endlessly get harassed about like what is the future of the book, and the thought that the new modes of communication and so on lead to a kind of devaluing of the book. And it's probably fair to say that it's simply astonishing how many books are produced in the architectural field, number one, and number two, it's also quite astonishing how few of them have any kind of cling to you like significant documents. And maybe that's the way of culture in general, that actually that there's a lot of work done by a lot of people that leads only to one or two things here and there that really stick, but I'm inclined to think otherwise. And so what's super amazing about this book by Mabel is it's a real book, like it's exactly the kind of thing that's not supposed to appear, which is an enormously thorough, convincing, and a kind of book for the ages, a book that obviously will take some time for its legacy to be worked through, and obvious symptoms will be the kind of conversation that will build around this book will almost certainly lead to other books. So I sort of feel that some done by Mabel and some done by others. And I suppose this evening is the beginning of the sound of this discussion that started by this absolutely wonderful piece of research, which of course, like all the best research, goes beyond the research, the looking again, to actually shaping a narrative. And once you listen to this narrative, you don't see pretty much anything the same way again, which is what I think a great book does. So I think it's just wonderful. I hope this is not like a freak accident in the architectural community that a real book comes out. I'd like to think that it's a sign of a kind of reaction to the world we live in today, and I think a kind of recovery of the value of deep scholarship. This is a book that took many years to produce. Mabel was astonishingly patient in waiting for the moment in which the book was, in her opinion, ready to roll, as it were, into the public world. And that very gesture, that patience and care with which the book was done, and I think also a wonderful relationship with the publisher that honored that intensity, seems to be at the exact opposite spectrum of the sort of instant communication that probably will have its own heroic works as well, but just hasn't happened yet. Meanwhile, we celebrate Professor Mabel Wilson. Mabel.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I just want to thank Mark, actually, for supporting the completion of this research. And I also just want to thank him for producing a body of theoretical work that has often forced me to think very differently and critically about architecture. There are many in the audience to whom I'm indebted, including those on the panel, indirectly and directly, have influenced parts of this work. And I also want to thank Gavin Browning for his generous assistance in organizing this event. Oh, there's Gavin. But I also want to include, as I include in my acknowledgements, Gavin's thoughtful and thorough edit sharpened the focus of my manuscript at a critical moment in its evolution. So I just wanted to thank Gavin. So tonight I wanted to bring together scholars and architects to discuss the broad disciplinary scope of the book. I thought I'd begin with an overview of some of the key themes, and then I want to invite each of tonight's panelists to make sort of a brief comment or response actually to a question I posed to him or her about both their own work in relation to the book. After that, we'll see what percolates into a discussion amongst the panel and you, the audience. Okay. So I just wanted to say something quickly about race. Race is a regime of power that operates ideologically, discursively, and materially to structure unequal social relations between human beings. Racism operates socially using race knowledge to forge inequalities. Racism, what scholar Paul Gilroy has called raciology, also operates spatially. At the turn of the 20th century, activist and sociologist W.E.B. Du Bois's identification of the problem of the color line articulated the spatial logic of anti-Black racism and segregation in the US. By limiting the physical movement of Black Americans, white supremacists could also limit their social and economic mobility. We should keep in mind that race is not a static or monolithic formation. It has and will change over time. As it appears, it will also disappear. But the current sanguine pronouncements of racist invisibility does not yet mean we have entered into that golden post-racial moment. It simply means that race's new articulations have yet to be made visible within lived and discursive fields. Therefore, the emergence of the study of Black peoples in the US has always had to contend with hostile institutional and discursive contexts. My early work as a scholar and as an architect on sites of Black cultural memory and power struggles to claim power struggles to claim space in a permanent fashion, such as the fight to build the African burial ground in Lower Manhattan, provided an easy transition into the foundational themes of Negro Building. While the book's chapters explore a range of topics from urban history to political and intellectual history, my preliminary research studied the emergence of Black history and cultural museums erected in the 1980s to understand how these institutions took root in formally segregated social and urban spaces, ones with difficult histories of racial violence. Birmingham, for example, has erected monuments and hosts a stately brick edifice, the Civil Rights Institute, that commemorates the Alabama steel towns. That commemorates the Alabama steel towns' bloody skirmishes between protesters and racist factions in the 1960s. Elsewhere, Memphis's National Civil Rights Museum occupies the renovated Lorraine Motel, where exhibits and programs memorialize the site where an assassin's bullet took the life of civil rights leader Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968. And there are soon to be new additions to the growing list of museums. Sorry, Dave, this is an old image, but it's the image from the book, so I wanted to use it. The most significant endeavor on the boards will be the Smithsonian's new National Museum of African American History and Culture. After decades of racist elected officials rejecting citizen-led initiatives and debates about the efficacy of a national institution, one history that the book narrates in detail, the new 300,000 square foot museum and research facility designed by Freelon Adjaye Bond will finally rise in the last remaining unbuilt site along the National Mall, across from the Washington Monument. And I'm delighted that David is able to be here this evening and share his insights on that very project. So taking stock of these laudable advances on cultural representations through architecture and exhibition, my book's research poses two questions. What does it mean for Black Americans to claim a physical space in the nation's symbolic cultural landscape? What does it mean for Black Americans to claim a symbolic space in the nation's historical consciousness? Negro Building's meticulous archival research shows that these have been two spheres in which Black American presence and contributions have been calculatingly rendered invisible for over 2 centuries. For architectural and curatorial presidents of today's contemporary Black museums of history and culture, we have to go back to the 1960s when the first grassroots museums were founded. To find the progenitors to these early museums, we have to survey the forgotten Emancipation expositions that began after 1910 and continued through the 1960s. And these celebrated emancipation all the way up to 63, which was the 100th anniversary. And prior to these events, we must look back over 100 years, beginning in the period after Reconstruction, to explore the great World's Fair's Negro buildings that were first erected in 1895, with the last appearing in 1936. What was a Negro building? My initial response when I first discovered this plate in the archive was literally, The first one was built in 1895 at the Atlanta Cotton States International Exposition. Looking at other Southern expositions, I discovered that there was a Negro Building erected in 1897 at Nashville's World's Fair, and then another one in 1901 at Charleston's World Fair, built by the same architect of the Atlanta Fair, Bradford Gilbert, and one more at Jamestown Exposition in 1907, this one designed by Black architect William Pittman. The last appearance of a Negro Building in a major World's Fair was Dallas's Hall of Negro Life in 1937. But why would the fairs, rather than museums, be these early venues for the display of Black culture and history in the United States? First and foremost, the fairs were temporary, not permanent. The great architectural talents of the time, Frederick Law Olmsted, Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, Paul Cray, Raymond Hood, and others like the lesser-known Bradford Grant, and the first Black graduate of Cornell, Vertner Tandy, built the phantasmal dream worlds that appeared for several months in metropolitan centers around the country. These men, and on occasion women, planned everything, the fairgrounds, the pavilions, and the layout of the exhibitions. Amid the wide open sunlit interiors filled with machines and manufacturers that turned raw materials into products before their very eyes, visitors witnessed a stunning visual teleology and geopolitical atlas about how past and future innovations, industrial capitalism, could transform their lives and the fortunes of the nation to lead the world. America's fairs paraded the nation's history as the natural outcome of an exceptional people destined to be great. Those powerful white politicians, manufacturers, and transportation titans who set the ideological tone for the expositions, these men also funded the great museums of the early 20th century, put the world from primitive to civilized on display so that the common sense of nation, race, and class could be known by those privileged to witness the spectacles. Within this comparative framework, Negro Buildings asks if what and who was shown or excluded reinforced beliefs that historically non-white peoples belonged in the lower ranks of civilization and the nation's advance. In my preface, I examine this family of man engraved for the first Centennial World's Fair in Philadelphia, which visualizes the progress of civilization. We see America leading the way for Europe, the dutiful, noble savage, timid Asia, and primitive Africa, with her rudimentary quiver of arrows symbolizing that her hands are destined to sustain her race. A mass-produced engraving for Leslie's Weekly, this image circulated beyond the fairgrounds and long after the pavilions were disassembled and the gates closed. As a consequence of this racialized as well as spatialized sociocultural hierarchy, certain groups, especially Asians, Native Americans, African, and American Negroes, were deemed exploitable for their resources and labor. In particular, this confirmed that Black people were incapable of reason and judgment, and therefore were unworthy of basic human and democratic rights. Beyond the fairgrounds, it was collectively determined that given their natural limitations, Black Americans should be, by law and custom, excluded from the mainstream public sphere. They should be segregated into their own areas of the city, and by extension of this logic, set apart in their own exclusive corner of the fairgrounds. This validated, as muckraking journalist Ida B. Wells protested at the World's Columbian Exposition in 1893, the rise of Jim Crow de jure racial segregation and the structural dominance of white supremacy for decades to come. As Negro Building argues, two of the fundamental questions for charting the race's forward advance in the 20th century were posed at the fairs. One, what would be the role of Black labor in the nation's burgeoning industrial economy? And two, how and when would Black citizens achieve social equality? The rise of Jim Crow segregation after Reconstruction had incrementally ratcheted back the public rights and private opportunities gained by former slaves after Emancipation. Since they were barred from participation in government and mainstream civic associations, Black citizens formed their own counter-public sphere that operated at the margins of the dominant American bourgeois public sphere and civil society. Activists Ida B. Wells, Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, artists Medeville Warwick Fuller, Henry O. Tanner, scholars Carter G. Woodson, Alain Locke, Horace Caton, and a host of other fair builders, primarily from the Black elite and intelligentsia, sought to disprove the bleak forecast augured by their fellow white citizens by taking measure of their own advancement. Acutely aware of the economic and political hurdles to achieve these goals, fair organizers commissioned pavilions as well as displays of mechanical devices, sociological data, dioramas, historical artifacts, artworks, industrial arts, pageants, performances, government propaganda, and other artifacts. Race leaders and the Black intelligentsia debated important aspects of these approaches at congresses devoted to the topics of religion and agriculture, business and industry, education and sociology, the role of the Black press, the African continent, the military, and women's issues. Booker T. Washington's racial uplift, with his emphasis on respectability and self-help, ideals resonant within American liberalism, would be a dominant message heard and seen at many of the early Southern Fairs Negro buildings. As anti-Black racism grew more strident and deadly in the early years of the 20th century, others sought more direct forms of confrontation. A rallying call for civil rights to gain social equality trumped patient servitude to white interests. From the perspective of civil rights activists like Du Bois, the problem was not the race's supposedly inherent traits of moral and intellectual inferiority, but rather the way that newly imposed shackles of Jim Crowism stalled any real social or economic advancement. The Great Migration brought large numbers of Blacks into the factories and neighborhoods of northern industrial centers. The exploitive conditions within Fordist manufacturing required a different set of tactics to improve the working conditions and life outside the shop floor. The rise of a vanguard of creative talent, a radical left inspired by socialism and communism, brought new representations and ideas to the Exposition Forum. During the New Deal era, these progressive fair participants like Arna Bontemps, Franklin Marshall Davis, and Margaret Burroughs saw their civil rights battles within an international arena of the struggle for human rights against authoritarian regimes such as Nazism. The rise of the grassroots movements of citizens who founded museums, again the late Margaret Burroughs with Dr. Charles Wright in the northern ghettos of Chicago and Detroit, already in the midst of post-Fordist and deindustrialization, recast racial progress in terms of Black pride and self-determination, themes central to the civil rights movement and Black nationalism of the 1960s. While today we no longer convene World's Fairs, erect Negro buildings, or host Emancipation expositions, visitors can roam the interpretive history galleries and gather in the spatial lobbies of the glass, stone, and steel structures of the nation's various Black history and culture museums. The Smithsonian's future museum will be housed in an architecturally ambitious new building centrally located on the National Mall. Standing amid the white marble archives of national patrimony, Director Lonnie Bunch proudly proclaims that the mission will be, quote, to help all Americans remember, and by remembering, this institution will stimulate a dialogue about race and help to foster a spirit of reconciliation and healing, end quote. In the long term, this unique social and architectural space for critical reflection will in turn project a vision of the collective future for all American citizens. Therefore, what can we learn from how previous groups of citizens negotiated changing racial and intraracial ideologies and navigated segregated public spaces in order to create a realm to show and view their own multivalent interpretations of race and nation, progress and history? Thanks. Okay, so I posed a question to each of the panelists, and so I'm going to start with Saidiya. I'm pleased to introduce Saidiya Hartman, Professor of English and Comparative Literature here at Columbia, where she is also appointed in the Institute for Research on Women and Gender. Saidiya helped me sort out a very messy laundry list of ideas that became the book's introduction, and for that I'm eternally in her debt. Saidiya's accolades are numerous, including being named a Rockefeller, Whitney Oates, Fulbright, and University of California Fellow. She has published numerous essays along with the groundbreaking book, Scenes of Subjection, and the haunting Lose Your Mother, a psychogeography about her travels in Ghana. In her body of work, Saidiya dissects the, quote, spectacular character of Black suffering, end quote, by showing us the terror of the mundane and quotidian facets of everyday life. Drawing upon this rich theoretical work, I've asked Saidiya to consider what and who can or cannot be witnessed in these exhibition halls, as envisioned by key race leaders such as Dubois, Washington, and others. Saidiya. I think you can turn on the lights and turn off the projector, please. Yeah, if you want to. Yeah, perfect. Yes. Yeah. Why don't we all go so we can get comfortable?
See, I have messy notes. That's why I needed to sit down so I could spread them all out. So, in response to Mabel's question to me, okay, Mabel says, one of the methods I used in Negro Building to develop my analysis was to contextualize the spectacle of affairs within cities in which they took place by juxtaposing a resonance or dissonance with the realities of everyday life for Black folks living in those places. And I guess I have a few remarks and a few questions, and most of my questions are about a kind of paradox. What does it mean for Negroes 30 years after the advent of the emancipation of slavery to have the need to kind of narrate a history of Black experience as a monumental history? So in some sense, there's something fundamentally paradoxical about trying to craft a monumental history for a subaltern group. So, so my remarks address those things. So the dissonance between the monumental and the everyday. What these Negro buildings afforded was not only the opportunity of designing an ideal city or city beautiful, but also of constructing a vision of Blackness, which, while demonstrating diversity, repressed and excised those features of the race at odds with the discourse of uplift. For example, the American Negro exhibit at the Paris Exposition allowed Dubois to construct a visual narrative of progress featuring the institutions, civic organizations, church, and businesses that demonstrated the race's advance since the emancipation of slavery. It was impossible for him to construct such an account in the slum of Philadelphia's 7th Ward and in a city where the Negro's development had been characterized by starts and stops, forward movement and retrogression. And I think it's interesting to note the kind of like the 500 photographs in the Georgia Negro exhibit and the lack of actually one photo used at all in the Philadelphia Negro, and his use of kind of graphs and tables and charts as a way to kind of depict a social relationship. Okay. So it was impossible for him to construct such an account in Philadelphia. The relation of Du Bois and other Negro intellectuals and exposition planners like Kelly Miller, Richard Wright Jr., Addie Hunton, to the urban milieu was complicated at best. Their writing on Negroes, especially those in the cities of the North, was often accompanied by the word problem, and focused on excess women in the city, promiscuous social relations, children born out of wedlock, infant mortality, unemployment, and crime. Had the Philadelphia Negro been staged as an exhibit in a Negro building, no doubt only the aristocracy of the race and the respectable working class, the small group of Black men working at Midvale Steel or small proprietors would have been represented. But as Mabel noted in both the Georgia and Philadelphia Negro studies, Du Bois illustrated the dire effects of racism on Black progress. Yet in the Philadelphia Negro, Du Bois also suggests that the legacy and customs of slavery were also responsible for the backwardness or the social arrest of the Negro. In the earlier study, the relationship between past and present isn't as neatly divided and absolute as in the grand narrative of progress staged in Paris. Forward movement rather than the tragic entanglement of slavery and the post-Reconstruction period define the tenor of this presentation. Moreover, much of what is identified as the influence of slavery and plantation customs on sexual morality and family form need also be attributed to the modernizing forces of urbanization, women and girls at work, strolling the streets seeking pleasure and adventure, dandies and sharpers enjoying dance halls, saloons, minstrelsy, Nickelodeons, vaudevilles, and movie theaters, the kind of amusements not approved by elites like Dubois. The difference between urban life in the North and the carefully managed picture of Atlanta has everything to do with who appears and who does not appear in these images. Do you have more time?
Yeah.
Okay. In the developmental narrative crafted by Dubois, the pictures of bourgeois and poor homes were implicitly placed and scaled in a before and after narrative that situated the poor as backward elements closer to slavery and the elites as realizing the ideals of the race in their forward movement. In this regard, many of the photographs used in the American Negro exhibit were like other photographs that were utilized in the social economy building, and they shared a kind of moral and temporal logic of the before and after photo, which is a common element in the genre of visual reform. The story of progress depends upon a juxtaposition or contrast of images, the before of decay, dirt, and disorder, and the afterness of cleanliness, virtue, and morality, or as in the case of the American Negro exhibit, the photographs of bourgeois homes with the presence of the father as the moral emblem of the intact family, as opposed to the kind of chance creatures we see captured in the photographs of the poorer sections of Atlanta, literally people who are just moving through the streets, and they're never identified. And many of those photographs of the poorer homes are actually depopulated streets, so the masses that occupy those spaces don't appear at all. And I guess I, again, want to say something about, the paradox of trying to claim space within the terms of a national narrative without disfiguring that national narrative. And I want to say something here about time and historical narration. As I mentioned earlier, that the whole logic of reform was kind of predicated upon this distinction of before and after, or even in a narrative of racial uplift, the only way of imagining historical movement was in terms of advance or retrogression. So I guess I'm just trying to open up the question of other ways of imagining motion, other ways of imagining practice. And I think that even as we think about the new museum that's being built, in writing or constructing a narrative of Black life in the US, that narrative isn't being constructed in the context of a certain contemplative distance from struggle, right? That one is always trying to craft an account within the space of entanglement, right? Within the context of social antagonism, within the confines of racial domination. And as Mabel so thoroughly and eloquently addresses, I mean, the paradox of actually trying to stage Negro progress and staging Negro progress in the US was that those attempts were constantly thwarted by the realities of kind of racism inside the US. So besides, the Paris Exposition, where the American Negro exhibit was actually housed in a building of social economy, most of these Negro buildings were at the margins, or they were housed near the midway with the other exotic attractions, and the meaning of the exhibit itself was transformed by those kind of curatorial practices and marginalizing, kind of spatial positioning of the museum, as well as the kind of, the affront of Jim Crow social space, providing the context for narrating an account of the race's advance. And I mean, I guess the last question I would want to raise is a question of kind of epistemic violence. I mean, if in scenes of subjection, I talk about these everyday forms of violence, and I guess I want to think about epistemic violence being related to the terms in which the kind of the subaltern or oppressed is forced to make legible their history, right? To kind of periodize their struggle. And we see the kind of the politics of the Negro Building and trying to make Black history legible is forced to kind of reinscribe a certain kind of master logic of history, and is forced in some sense to mime the grand narrative that actually positions them at the margins and the outside of history. And that's it.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you. I think we can maybe come back around and start to talk about some of these. I just wanted to introduce Gwen Wright. Gwendolyn Wright is a professor of architecture here at GSAPP. Her important books, Building the Dream and Moralism and the Modern Home, incorporated a social historical perspective on the topic of domesticity and home building into the writing of architectural history. Her most recent book, USA Modern Architecture, traces the significance of a distinctly American contribution to the formation and development of modernism. When not inspiring students in her American history lecture course in this room, Gwen is inspiring history buffs around the world as one of the hosts of the popular PBS series, History Detectives. In USA Modern Architecture, Gwen eloquently describes one of the paradoxes modern American architects face, which was being caught between their democratic hopes and aspirations versus the everyday conditions, often chaotic, disorderly, and unequal social spaces where most Americans lived and worked. My question to Gwen is, with your recent survey in mind, are there moments when, places where, and constituencies for whom American architects successfully ameliorated social inequalities, particularly those of Black Americans, through progressive architectural designs? Thank you, Gwen.
Thank you, Mabel. I'd like to put that in a somewhat larger context of all of us in this room and this school, because I think that Mabel's book challenges all of us as professionals, as architects and planners and preservationists and developers, as historians, and as people in various public spheres that are always overlapping. And so there are a couple of questions I found myself asking myself, and I'd like to ask all of you, and then I'll pick up on your question. But one is, can we be as determined and as focused about the significant purposes and very long timelines as her characters? The thing that I found so appealing again and again was to see a person in 1890, and then in 1900, and then in 1902, and then in 1905, continuing learning from an exhibition, maintaining a sense of purpose. And I think it really reminds us it's not only your patience that Mark had alluded to as a historian, but also within a world in which there is often a very fast-paced notion of what it is you're concerned about now. How do we choose topics that really matter to us? That then leads us to one of the main focuses of the school. How can we imagine and then create places that make a difference? And I think one of the other major themes of her book is that it's not just making a difference in terms of facades or even the inside of spaces, but places that generate what she calls these counter-public spheres. That is, places that affect people's beliefs, their sense of what is possible, and even what happens when they go back home, when they go to work, when they go to spaces outside of that building. We don't ask ourselves those questions, and I think they're absolutely central. Again, this takes continuous work, but I'd like for us to raise these kinds of questions here at the school. The third is, can we be as astute about research? Again, not only Mabel's rather daunting example in terms of the thoroughness of the research that she did, but to raise important questions for all of us. And this is now getting into some of the themes that I found recurring in terms of doing a history of modern architecture and by extension of modern urbanism in the United States. And that is, how much we believe in research. We believe that statistics and photographs and documents and before and after, all of these that become in many ways cliches, that if we simply put them on the wall, that it'll be clear what to do. The fact is, we don't even know what to do ourselves once we do this, and we certainly don't, for all of our talk about research in the school, have a clear enough sense of what are the various possible lessons from it. And I think it's one of the most powerful and critical themes in the book. How do we actually take up this challenge, in particular, of having research that might have different effects, that will have one effect upon people who you want to inspire and uplift, and another effect on people who you want to challenge about normative ideas that they have accepted that are ultimately critical of one group or don't believe that certain things are possible. And I think that becomes a very important way, as we, all of us, engage research more directly, to think about how to envision several different kinds of responses and to challenge ourselves. We can't tell what those responses are going to be. They're not self-evident. Now this leads us, I think, directly to one of the key terms in the school, which is experimentation. And in fact, experimentation is a rigorous and long-term process. And you've shown people experimenting with what a certain kind of space and certain kinds of displays can do. The book is, in many ways, a confirmation of how important it is to look. That it's all about these efforts that these people were making to realize how significant it is, what is put on display, what a space is like, what the experience of walking through these displays can be, what is the sequence that you're going through, and yet those can't in and of themselves determine the outcome. We have to come back to this process of looking for things we hadn't expected and opening ourselves up. Now, that leads me to some of the themes that I had found especially exciting when I was taking up this challenge of looking at American modern architecture, but trying to turn it on its head rather than it being the same old group of architects, who of course great architects who we usually look at, instead to say, what were significant changes in modern life in America? Changes in terms of housing conditions for the poor, for blacks, for immigrants, for the middle class. What were changes in terms of working conditions in factories and in offices? What were changes in terms of schools and universities? And how did various architects, ones who were well known and ones who were, in some cases, not very well known at all, how did they seize upon those opportunities? And I think in many ways, they were taking up a challenge that you have raised of finding opportunities to help people become more aware. And one of those, in fact, had to do with two premises, that is with schools and universities, of looking at the difference between schools in the South that were segregated, many of which we have actually praised as being modern buildings. And I think we have to ask ourselves, what are our terms about what is modern? Can something be truly modern if it is as discriminatory as Paul Rudolph's High School in Florida, which was actually one of the mainstays of resisting Brown v. Board of Education? How do we look at the ways in which certain universities made a great effort to actually be more inclusive and to have a slightly more chaotic kind of environment in doing that? How do we begin to look at suburbs and not simply to have the critique of Levittown or Park Forest, which are certainly deserved, but to realize that there were suburbs in the late 1940s and early 50s that not only had modern houses, but in which the developers and the architects insisted they had to be racially integrated. And so I find it quite positive how often we see these things coming together, where you see good architecture, having an environmental focus, looking at ways to respond to the topography and looking at ways to simultaneously engage a social and cultural shift. And that goes along with something that I was by chance talking about this morning in my Histories of American Cities class, and that is one of the points that you raised that I think is very important for us to think about here in this school, and that is what you talk about as the Black metropolis ideal. That is the principle, not only in Harlem and in Chicago, but in Atlanta and in New Orleans and in Philadelphia, of turning the segregation of this country on its head, and of spirited artists and writers and dancers and composers and architects saying, okay, if you guys are gonna segregate us, we're gonna show you what we can do. And within that, creating extraordinary, visionary kinds of artistic forms, and with that, stimulating a political activism that I think is inspiring and can therefore be what was called Afro-Modernity, and is something that we need to incorporate in terms of how we think about modernity in terms of the history of architecture in this country and elsewhere, and in terms of how we think about history within this school. And I'll leave with just one of the other points that I think is really key, and that is to constantly remind ourselves about the dual nature of difference. It's something that Louis Hahn, one of the photographers who you work with, was constantly reminding us of too. On the one hand, difference is a matter of cultural distinctions and of individual talents, which should be respected and nurtured and celebrated. On the other hand, it is very different, it is very easy to have difference actually be a matter of inequalities that we accept by saying, well, that's how these people are, or that's how their lives are going, or we can't do anything about that. And so I think you've juxtaposed celebration and critique so that each one is infusing each other in ways that I found very inspiring. So I thank you.
Thank you, Gwen. So I just want to introduce the last panelist, David. David Adjaye's practice is truly transnational, with offices in London and Berlin, satellites in New York and Accra. His collaborations with artists such as Chris O'Feely, Olafur Eliasson have set a foundation for practice that explores light, color, texture, spatial complexity, and the perceptual expectations of the viewer. While working in all corners of the globe, his project for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Denver and the National Museum of African American History and Culture, which is always a mouthful to say, have enriched the architectural discourse of the US. When David has discussed his collaboration with the late J. Max Bond and Phil Freelon on the National Museum, he's mentioned the importance of having someone who was of African descent on the team, and that it captured the spirit of the institution's mission and brought a diasporic vision to the project's design. One of the points I make in the book, and one that I had not anticipated from the outset, but actually came from the research, was how important Pan-Africanism, or really seeing the Black American experience within a larger diasporic experience, an alternative ethos of national belonging, was critical in the formation of a modern African American cultural sensibility. With the political subtext of this legacy in mind, I asked David, is there a Pan-Africanist sensibility in your design for the museum or the projects you might have thought done in the US, and how might it contribute to the ongoing conversation about African American cultural contributions and ongoing political struggles in the US? So no small question, David.
And maybe when you ask that question, I think it's a very pertinent question right now. I'm going to discuss it through the experiences of an architect, sort of working now within the sort of framework that I find myself in, and in a way to say that in tackling any project, the issue of the reference becomes central and critical. It's not something that is taken for granted, in the sense that the context is always something that's always to be read immediately. And the narrative of that context is something that's always ahead of any engagement that already begins. So So as an architect of color working, this is something that's almost part of the kind of double consciousness that you're working with, the Duboisian consciousness that you're already sort of beginning to operate in. So one, always reading that reference, whether it's a kind of neoclassical reference or a sort of European modernist reference, it's still really kind of sort of working within those scripts. I'll use a kind of story about the competition that Lonnie shared with us when we sort of won, which was that in our presentation of the building, we were the only team that didn't use a kind of traumatic trope in the narrative of, the sort of, I would say, the condensed narrative of the African American experience as a way of modeling an image of the building. That we decided that that it was critical to not play that dialectic of, sort of traumatic proposition as a way to kind of foster a sense of engagement in any way, but to somehow provide simply another narrative which stands directly in parallel to the dominant narratives that are kind of operating, and to allow that narrative to start to unfold other stories. I mean, and I love your book for that, because it really speaks to the way in which some of the traumas and the evolution of this idea of being able to place a narrative within the dominant context kind of appears. We thought that instead of trying to make a kind of, there are several strategies architects would know. You either make a kind of a rigorous analysis of the programmatic content, you make a hyper model from that, you exaggerate form and structure, and you make something new. You take something from the narrative that exists in terms of the history, or you play on the context, which is the neoclassical dominance of the mall and its script, and you kind of make a mutation within that. You kind of make a mutation on domes and forms like that. What we said was that maybe there was another way of making a form which would start to really just unapologetically lay out a series of scenarios. Scenarios being the scenarios where, could we accept that that all buildings are in a way sort of rooted in some kind of human experience, and that all the narratives that are sort of referenced by architects have a kind of relevance that can be readable. So why can't we start with a narrative which maybe starts to look at tropes which are more founded in the notion of silhouette and profile, and what I mean by that is something that I formulated is a kind of a DNA which comes from looking at the artifacts of West Africa, let's say, as a starting point. And for me, the reason for looking at that was that essentially, if one is speaking about a kind of narrative that can start to speak about a language, that the dominant groups from the African American experience come from West Africa and Central Africa, Angola, and essentially Senegal, Nigeria, Ghana. Critically, there are other places, but these are the dominant groups. And in a way, there was a kind of powerful narrative in those areas which I think are embedded in the DNA of the artifacts of those places. So one could argue that even with the colonial tabula rasa of the urban environments, which most people would understand, there is a kind of implicit DNA that is in the tropes of objects made by ritual, makers, because the culture essentially was the ritual nature and the built form were kind of implicitly connected. So there was a way to sort of say, could we just simply pick a narrative which hasn't had a lot of sort of light shed on it and use that as a kind of starting point? And could we imagine another story where, instead of a classical story which becomes a neoclassical story, etc., could you imagine another story where the hybridization occurs through a kind of reading very directly of some of the critical sort of mutations that occur through migration and influence? So in a way, the building is neither one thing or the other, but the sum of a series of hybrid situations that come together to form another story. So, I mean, without sort of getting too deeply into it, you are able to, if you want to read that story, because it's woven consciously into the way in which you read the building, as in it's a building which signifies its its sort of root through a different language, not the language of cornices and columns, but through profile, very explicitly through profile. But then its detail becomes something that unfolds a story to you as you go into it, i.e. the notion of southern life as a kind of root, sort of tropical life, and the kind of way in which tropical life has a kind of implicit sort of mark in the way in which spaces are used within certain communities, the idea of indoor-outdoor spaces, blurring zones of interiority and exteriority, and how that's something that is kind of enjoyed in New Orleans and Charleston, all these kind of places. These are implicit kind of codes that kind of work, and how that can somehow maybe also become something that starts to play within the idea of how to make this building. And then, when we're talking, it was fantastically interesting for me to see the way you sort of uncovered the history of the exhibit, or the Jim Crow sort of spectacle, and the notion of spectacle versus. We were extremely concerned about this idea of, and the museum, as we've sort of worked with them, have it's become very clear that there's this extraordinary sensitivity in the idea that how do you start to present the content so that it's not about spectacle, but it has a visual kind of power, but it's not at the same time confrontational. It's not trying to kind of make a kind of that sort of either or position that you sort of mentioned, and there's been an incredible amount of there are 47 curators working in this museum trying to kind of uncover that, and we'll see how that works. But essentially, what's become very clear is that there is a kind of need to make both the functional space of reading exhibits charged with a certain kind of deliberate agenda to make those spaces be part of the narrative of trying to neutralize the sense of kind of justification. So a kind of empowerment of the spaces becomes very important, that the space has a kind of its own present power that allows the visitor just to kind of enjoy it or use it for its own sake. This has become something that's scripted through the building, and you'll find the way in which everything from the foyer to the main spaces kind of unfolds this narrative. And so what we're hoping is that, that through that sort of placement of something which doesn't try to kind of play a sort of confrontation, but just plays its own narrative just very clearly, it says, okay, this is another narrative that runs, it starts to hopefully collapse and unfold opportunities which can start to kind of operate. And in a way, my own work, I guess, is a summary of that. In Denver, the same sort of issues about the exclusion of certain communities in the art world were played through that narrative. So I want to use those as examples rather than specifically speaking to the notion that it's a Pan-African reference. That, this idea of the notion of the marginalized being brought into the center was really the kind of driving agenda behind how the Denver Museum project worked. This idea of kind of dissolving barriers of doors and thresholds and gated systems that kind of say you are not in and you are allowed. All these sort of, and then the idea of making new urban narratives within the idea of a building rather than forms that are overtly about certain power structures was kind of very important in the way that works. So in a way, I'm sort of offering these two moments, and they are consciously scripted through the kind of experience that I have as an architect of color, of course, and sort of working within certain dominant narratives and wanting to kind of unfold those narratives to kind of be engaging in its widest sense.
Great, thank you so much. So I just want to thank you all three for those incredible, I think, contributions to a take on an interpretation of the book. I mean, I think, David, your characterization of the importance of a form and how it can be read in a particular context is very critical to the Negro buildings, to the expositions and the way they were laid out and designed, and to the contemporary museums. I mean, I always found the Detroit Mobile Museum to be a really radical move. It's to say, okay, well, you're not going to allow us to build, but can we utilize a kind of, stealth entity to actually move the display onward. And then, Gwen, I think you bring up the interesting point of the agency of the architect, right, in terms of how do we understand what we do, and not only what we do as architects, but also what we make has also implications for those people who are actually inhabiting those things. And so I think you bring up the important question of agency within, as you talked about, the various food groups, as I call them, in GSAPP preservation as planners and so forth, and trying to understand how architects are bringing significant change to the lives of those people who are going to be occupying their various buildings. And Saidiya, as always, I think you bring incredible depth to sort of thinking about one of the key questions that I've always had within this book is how do we understand progress in the various ways in which every single one of these venues was to argue for the so-called progress of the race. And you bring up precisely this question of the techniques of representation, the photograph, the statistics, which are presented precisely to enact a kind of difference. This is where we've come from. And I think it's interesting in the way in which African Americans were able to use those techniques, in fact, to argue their own position. So for example, that you even see in Atlanta, Black Americans were saying, well, we aren't those literally, we're not those African savages. And we're going to be going to Liberia, Sierra Leone to bring religion to the so-called primitive and savages. So there's always this calibration of difference that's being presented, discussed, and represented in those venues. And so one of the questions that maybe we can discuss a little bit further, and I think it's the challenge of both Black architects, but also I think the people who are actually organizing these fairs, is how do you work within those master narratives and with those master tools to begin to work on these particular subjects, right? And so for me, what was phenomenal in the research that I did is to see the number of Negro buildings, right, that unfold. And you get William Pittman, who's a Black architect, who is actually the son-in-law of Booker T. Washington, designs this beautiful colonial pavilion. I mean, it was a stunningly beautiful pavilion, as if to say, yes, we as Black architects can work in the neoclassical language, right, of the city beautiful. And then a few years later, you get Dubois hiring Vertner Tandy to make this Egyptian temple. And I'm like, what is that? What is Dubois basically saying, well, we don't need that Judeo-Christian architecture of the classicism, and do we need to find another kind of aesthetic? And yet, I think Dubois, as Saidiya points out, is also working within those same sort of master frameworks, particularly as a sociologist in that way. And so I guess one of the things I was curious if we can discuss, like how does one work within those frameworks, particularly to constantly bring forth that question of the struggle and not to get necessarily buried by.
I mean, I think that I loved when I saw that image of the Du Bois pavilion, which is startling because in a way, I think Du Bois does, feel this kind of. I think there's a moment where he feels a kind of hopelessness of the whole thing. So he offers this counter model in that moment. But I think that actually what Du Bois also asks is for a kind of. I don't think he necessarily is advocating that there is a kind of another model that needs to counter the dominant model, but that there should be an independence that also sort of emerges from this condition. And I mean that's my sort of belief of what I think ultimately Du Bois kind of hopes for.
Well, let me come in on that. I wondered when I first saw it if this was Afrocentrism of all the let's way. If this was the notion that in fact the Egyptians were Black and therefore this is a way of looking back to.
Completely.
Could he possibly have thought that, since it becomes an argument later on? Yeah. And this was the beginning of doing, Breasted and others doing very serious work about early Egypt. Yeah. And so was this, to some extent, a subterfuge? Now, it also raises, I think, an interesting question for you in your effort not to have this architecture for the museum be a critique of American racism, but instead to be looking at the possibilities of growth within that, and for a range then of people who would come. Perhaps there were ways too in which Du Bois, who was so brilliant, was looking to have an alternative to neoclassicism as this unifying aesthetic, which of course was an aesthetic based on slavery, and which he was very aware of what that meant. And so he was simply choosing another form, possibly with these Afrocentrist ideas, at least looking to it being an African country, but also allowing a kind of ambiguity. I mean, it's a weird building. Everybody should read the book, if only to see this building, because it really is a big surprise. But it's one of the few examples of someone choosing strange architecture, really, because quite often you have to look hard. They're grainy photographs. You've done extraordinary work, but there is a sense of wanting to accept conventional models of architecture through many of these, until we get around to this wonderful mobile museum. And then it could, Raider Banham could have done this. It's just really fabulous that it too is playing on the 1960s, on the sense of things that are movable, things that are temporary, things that can come in and out of your life. It's really interesting to see points when that happens. But it's not done self-consciously as design. It is simply really good curatorial vision.
Yeah, but I think what I think is interesting in the case of Dubois is that when he does he does this temple of beauty.
Temple of Beauty.
And it still has a lot to be unpacked about that. And then he stages this entire pageant, and for him, pageantry was very important to perform, for Black Americans to be able to perform, right, their identities. But nonetheless, I think it's still a mythic Africa, and it's an idealized, it's an idealized history in some respects that he's crafting. And I think it gets back to what Saidiya said, is that Du Bois has an ideal vision of the race, in a way. And that then there's this whole other side that he just, in a way, doesn't contend with, because he always sees that it has to be somehow literally reformed, remade in some regards.
Can I say something about that? I mean, I think that, Du Bois at that moment is still very much, invested in a civilizationist discourse, right? So he, it's an epic and it's a grand history. I mean, it would be interesting to think about that moment with like 1935 when he's written Black Reconstruction, and he's, imagining a history with a different kind of agent, and that agent is a working class. And I guess I'm introducing this to, in a way to kind of think about the museum and how we think about social process and practice and evanescence in the context of the museum, or if the museum is just a building to kind of like house cultural contributions, right? And I guess, there are the parallel narratives, but there's also the museum as a space that can make or facilitate something happening. And maybe that happening isn't about the critique of American, racism, but thinking about the question of American democracy. So that would be a different Du Bois, and that would be, the museum space would press in multiple directions in that sense. So I don't know if that's different than the parallel narrative, if I'm trying to.
Well, I think it is. I think it is. I think that I mean, going back to that, I think what you're saying is absolutely right, because actually, predicated in the building, which is hard to see until we've got it finished, is that idea that it allows a certain kind of pageantry to occur through it. It allows a certain kind of spontaneity to also occur almost around it, and that's a kind of scripting that's in the building. To sort of counter a sort of narrative. But in a way also, for me, I think what's also interesting about the Egyptian building, even though it is a fiction, is that it also points to the fiction of classicism, which is also a complete fabrication of a master race. It's an invention. And so he sort of plays, it almost in a way for me plays the mirror. It almost puts the mirror up in front of the object. And I think it's a powerful sort of destabilizer for anybody who visits to sort of think because he kind of proposes it almost as a complete trope that you should know, because it's so complete. And it's fiction. You think, isn't this something? And I think there's something very powerful about what that was trying to do. But in a way, ultimately, it fails because of it fails for me from a kind of in the way that it tries to just make an either or. But because ultimately they're both the same route. They're both classical buildings, and they go through. But I think what it does offer is a space which is taking a long time, but the problem is that you know, as you say, with any trauma, it takes such a long time to be able to become reflective and then to be able to develop a kind of response. And where is that moment where the trauma is far enough away to be able to then start to reflect objectively, to start to kind of form a critique and a kind of positioning. And I think that maybe the beginnings of this is maybe, I think we're at sort of at a time where we can start to kind of map that a bit more in your book. I mean, what you've written could not be possible even 30 years ago. I think it would have been so traumatic to say Negro buildings. I mean, I know so many people who would be traumatized by that. But actually now one can, you know, in an objective way understand exactly the trajectory and kind of the formation of that.
No, it's one of the things I've thought of in reading through this is, which I've wondered about for years, is why in this extraordinary outpouring of the Black metropolis ideal, it occurred in every art form except architecture. It's in photography, it's in dance, it's in music, it's in writing, it's in costume design, it's everywhere, and it takes over. It is part of one of the other things that's going on here. It's an effort to try to change how Blacks think about themselves and about creativity, and it's a kind of in-your-face response to white society, but it also dumbfounds many whites who are just astounded at this level of creative outpouring. And why it doesn't happen in architecture. Because there are architects at this point. And it's also distinctively modern. It's modern in a way that almost no whites in the US or in Europe were being modern. There's a sense of play and color and dynamism and mixing and a kind of free-spirited but very controlled and focused, often classical training, but then comes into this new realm. And so it may be one of the reasons why we don't have these architectural designs that seem comparable to what is intellectually being carried through.
Yeah, and they may have been built, but in neighborhoods that are no longer existing, unfortunately.
Yeah. Right.
So why don't we open it out to the audience if people have questions? Can you get the lights? If possible. Question in the middle. I think they're going to bring you a...
It's only a microphone.
Professor Wilson, for also having this event. 5 years at Columbia is the first time I've been in this auditorium, which says something about disciplinarity than anything else. But finding myself here and with people from so many different points of view thinking about this large question, Negro Building is an amazing event, and thank you so much for this. I guess I wanted to come back to the question about monumental space in a way to think about museums and fairs, and also the image of the Detroit Traveling Museum and how it kept on moving. Because I was also thinking about other forms of ephemerality and monumental, creations of monumental spaces in the example of Boston Garden in 1968 when James Brown performs there in order to, there's a beautiful documentary called How James Brown Saved Boston, right? All these different places, all these different cities are burning because of these expressions of Black urban uprising, and then basically the stadium, which was not meant to be used as a monumental space to reflect on Black cultural production and what it can contribute, ends up being that way. So as a person who studies architecture but also designs, what are the ways that even we stumble on different kinds of Negro buildings, or a building becomes a Negro building just by a mere fact? I'm just trying to expand this term and just learn from how Black history is being created through space and through these buildings, and are there other ways to even expand that term to think about how we talk about the practices that occur in those spaces?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually a good question, because when I started the project, I really was going to write about that last image. I wanted to write about these museums, physical, and I was curious as to why groups of Blacks in places like Memphis and as I said, Birmingham, Detroit, were literally able in the 80s to build those buildings, to get the financing, hire the architects and build them. particularly in places that had been segregated and violently segregated. And that clearly the ability to build in that public domain was just not available. And so I kind of had to change the register to actually find the historical evidence. So rather than looking for permanent buildings, I actually had to look for temporary structures and temporary spaces. And as soon as I looked for that, boom. I mean, there was just this, because that was the logic of segregation, was that you can't, there were places you couldn't be.
Yeah.
And so I really had to think very, very, very differently. And also, you know, segregation controlled the amount of capital that was available for building, I mean, all of that stuff was being controlled. So people just couldn't accrue wealth. And so it made it very difficult for people to build. And the book has a number of stories of people who tried to organize color expositions and just literally couldn't get the funding. I mean, it was just, the money wasn't there. So I had to think differently about what it was that I was looking for to find that register. But once you start to think about these temporary, as you're suggesting, Boston Garden, it's an event, people are coming into the space, taking it over and transforming it, then all of a sudden you find all of these examples that existed. And so, you know, I think it requires about, you know, thinking about architecture perhaps slightly differently, or building differently.
I don't really know where to begin because I disagree with so much. But I will start by saying that the trauma, I will start by saying that I was on one of the other design teams for the museum. And we did evoke the idea of trauma. And I think personally it's about evoking that in a way, not sort of forgetting about it. Because what happens in these museums or these buildings that we do as black architects is the work does evoke a trauma. And what happens is the building doesn't. Architecture is still one of those bastions that has not caught up. I can't think of a Louis Armstrong or a John Coltrane playing without understanding a level of trauma in some of the works that they have created. I can't think of Billie Holiday singing without thinking about trauma. This reminds me of the first time that Jelly Roll Morton, who was, you know, arguably one of the first three inventors of the blues, was at home with his mother, and his mother told him to play classical because that's the music that he had to learn to play. But he went downtown and learned blues and honky-tonk and became the purveyor of blues music, which begat jazz. And again, the trump of this room is look at who's in this room and who's going to be in this room when Rem Koolhaas comes here. It's automatically a trauma. I think what architecture has to do is understand that and has to accept that that's part of the narrative and make that narrative. In that museum, there's going to be a rope, and that rope has a trauma to it. But the architecture itself will never, ever be able to meet what that rope represents in the minds of people. And architecture is for people, and the black architect, more so than possibly any other architect, should understand that. We should be trying to connect, and what we don't do is connect. We disconnect. And for the sake of what is always my question, instead of understanding where we come from, what we've been through, and then how to make that jazz out of blues. We negate the blues trying to get to jazz, and it's not going to work. And I'll leave it with this comment, that blues is the ultimate black music. Jazz is the ultimate American music, and that's more of the trauma and the problem that we find ourselves in as black people in this country.
We always have this spar.
I just have a question. What's the trauma? I just want to make sure.
I have no idea.
Okay, okay.
No, I think that, you know, quite honestly, I think that the narrative has many facets to it than just trauma. And I think that it's bigger than just one moment within this kind of large trajectory of 200 years.
And I guess I raised the question, like, you know, what is the trauma? Because that just sounds, you know, incredibly euphemistic, but trauma also raises questions of eventfulness and belatedness. Yeah. So again, it's presupposing that event and our distance from it, and it seems like, well, what is that event? Let's clearly articulate its terms, and then what is the distance that we're, you know, presupposing? And I mean, I guess I have a question for you, Mabel, which is also about the kind of the mobile van that's moving through the streets in this state of crisis and is having, I don't know, I mean, I guess I wanted you to talk about more what's inside the van, because is Black pride and self-determination ultimately different from progress in terms of what it stages, in terms of what's inside the kind of the mobile van, or how is it that we have like a relationship with the present? Because I don't know that we could say that so many of the antagonisms of American history can be periodized and contained and under this general rubric of trauma, as much as we're involved in this kind of like ongoing struggle in the context of something. Maybe it's called race, maybe it's not race, maybe it's about democracy, maybe it's about, you know, citizenship and equal distribution of the wealth, but let's just have our terms be clear.
Yeah. No, I actually think the question about the mobile museum, which actually was circulated, it had its first opening literally right after the Detroit riots in '66, if I recall correctly. And that was literally a mobile home that had been turned into an exhibition that had literally a kind of history of African culture, African history, and basically African civilization within it, that brought it up to partially at the contemporary, right, American history. But what I was trying to kind of show in that chapter was the degree to which it was even almost less about the museum, and maybe this is true about the whole book. It wasn't so much about the place, but the relationships of the people that were continually, and this goes back to Gwen's point, coming back again and again and trying to build a community of people around these particular issues. And that when I started writing that chapter, there was so much that I realized this institution, the so-called museum, was involved with. I mean, they were basically a community activist organization. And whenever there was a new law about housing or something, they were sending somebody out to a meeting, or they weren't acting as what we would call a traditional museum at all. They were much more community-based, grassroots, and actually were engaged in the politics of what was going on. They were sponsoring educational programs for children and for adults, and I'm sure part of it echoes what we could see the Black Panthers, for example, doing in Oakland, but they were coming more from the Black middle class, but nonetheless felt that they were very much rooted in that kind of community activism. And what I found ironic was when they built the building, right? It kind of completely, to the point where somebody even said, we've lost our nationalist spirit, right? And they inherited a building, they had to maintain the staff, they had to hire the directors, one after, they kind of lost that sort of investment within the community once they actually had the physical building. And that's what I thought was very sort of ironic about that particular institution.
And at that point, there's then one narrative, and I think that, obviously everybody knows the trauma of slavery and the trauma of segregation. These are not things that we're asking, what are you talking about? It's, I think, though, quite legitimate to say that there are important ways not to get stuck in the criticism of something that has gone wrong when there are possibilities of trying to make significant changes and to address the repercussions of the things that have gone wrong. And you have many instances of people doing this, of using architecture, of using display, of using political action. And I think that the ending with the Detroit Mobile Museum is a wonderful idea, because it shows people seizing hold of those problems and doing something with it in a way that you are attempting to do with this design for the museum too, that there'll be an experience of moving through it that will affect people in different ways, rather than one narrative that we try to force people to take in.
I mean, I was super inspired by that image, because in a way, it's forced the community to almost become incredibly radical. Mm-hmm. You could almost argue that it's central, the mutation that it has to always kind of perform in the face of adversity, and the sort of the strategies that it unfolds becomes a kind of radical modernity that it sort of unpacks, and that mobile museum is ironically the kind of strategies that contemporary institutions now want to use as ways of outreaching to communities.
Yeah.
This model, which comes out of this kind of traumatic sort of, and in a way, I think that all artistic, traditions work like this. If you think of even the artistic, Rose, the Armat sort of urinal, I'm going to flip it a bit. This idea of being able to kind of being rejected from the mainstream creates this incredible trajectories, this radical trajectories, which can allow new sort of readings to occur. And I think that's a kind of profound quality that has come out of all the kind of traumas, the various traumas that are being referred to.
Mm-hmm.
Other types of buildings. Museums, in a way, are community clubs. The Whitney is a kind of community club. The new museum, it's a kind, it reflects the fact that it was directed by guerrilla girls, and then the museum, it's a museum director woman, and it has, so museums are in a way a reflection of one group and one group aspiration, and they could very well reflect a traumatic moment or not, or many narratives or not. And that issue of, that was a decision, and a decision that the architect and the team commissioning the museum decided on. And so I think that the idea that the museum in Detroit that kind of abandons this community base and becomes divorced from it, it's a reflection of not understanding that really great museums sometimes are very related to a very narrow and potent community message.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point in terms of beginning to understand the strategies of these particular groups in establishing these institutions. And it was true, also for the first, what could be called Black Culture and History Museum in Chicago, which was the DuSable as well, that actually came out of one of these expositions. And so it was the direct link I found between the expositions and the first museums. And Margaret Burroughs, who founded that, was very much very left and very much was a part of a creative and intellectual community of Chicago in the 40s that somewhat got squelched in the 50s with all of the Red Scare, but she nonetheless came back in the 1960s and established this out of her home, well, out of an old home, not out of her home, but out of an old home that was nearby in the south side of Chicago. And again, that's another museum that's now in a park. It's in a traditional and has been, it's very well known and established, but nonetheless is further away from the community in which it originated in some respects.
Anybody, particularly David, on the jury, because I was happy that firm won that group won the project. I felt like they were the beginning of something new and we were the end of something, even though I liked our team and what we did. My comment was more that when you forget or you negate the trauma becomes then overpowering. And in the DuSable Museum in Chicago, that's what happened again. That was actually a black architect who designed that building. And there is no aesthetic. There's nothing that says anything to a person coming to that building, but once a person is inside, and the same thing with Phil Freeland's building in Baltimore. Once you're inside, there's a lot that grips you as a person who has lived in this country. And then other people who are not African American who can come and can learn. That trauma is there in the actual artifacts, in the actual instances that are prescribed and actually connected there. So the architecture continued to fail us, and that's the point. Not every building has to do this. Not every building has to bespeak of this. But too often as architects, we have negated it. Again, to me, the tragedy of the Dubois result or his representation is that he had nowhere else to go. There was nothing permeating in American architecture that would have allowed him to at least have a visual aesthetic that says something about architecture like we have in music, or we even have in painting, we have in literature and poetry. I can't imagine, again, Langston Hughes not talking about the condition. And that's not all he talks about, so I don't want anybody to misunderstand that. but it is sort of embedded and rooted in almost all other aspects of our lives. And our music is loved by the world, but our music comes from the blues.
Yeah, no, I think that's an excellent point, Jack. And I think that, and I think this is perhaps David's point about the hybridization, right? And also what you talk about, blues being basically, Black American music or Black music that then becomes jazz, which becomes, as to use your example, and American music, and the role of hybridization and this merging of different forms to create something different. And I just think that within architecture, you start to see some of this happening, and I think in the book, the Dubois example is the one that just resonates because it just happens at that moment. But he's also writing a pageant. He's also staging it there's choreographers, there are musicians that are involved there, and so he creates this sort of total environment, to use that term, around that space, which I think is actually quite phenomenal. Now, what that meant to experience that, and
so
how
what kind
people...
of music did he use?
What kind of music? Well, he would actually use a different, he would use, depending on the scene, different types of music, right? He did this in a number of his pageants that were staged. And he would also see literally the performance as a kind of exposition of American, Black American music. And so you would get actually classical music that was written by Black composers, but you would also get spirituals, as well as more contemporary music. And so in that context, I think Du Bois was trying to literally create a kind of oeuvre of Black cultural production in those sites, which included both the architecture and music. Kyle.
Well, I'd like to, just for the sake of conversation, perhaps put the word trauma under erasure and maybe replace it with spirit or essence or grain, because Cornel West often says that blues rise on the dissonance of the blue note, and that blue note speaks to the African American condition, where there is that certain grain. And as young architects, we often see that when there's a monument to Black culture, that it reifies a certain narrative, but we'd like to see a place where there's more of a diamonism that happens in Afro-Modernity, whether that be through painting, through literature. And when that is the case, like we're looking for a place where, I guess I'd say, for example, when you look at the African burial ground as it was realized, there's a reified narrative of the single story of there were Africans who were once here, and we're going to have a monument to those remains in this place, and then there's a collecting institution that has a single narrative, rather than there being a place where there is it speaks to the multivalence of the African condition. And so what the hope is that through the project of Negro Building, that there's a call for more of a Black aesthetic to be developed, so that when we look through African antiquity, we're not just looking at this Egyptian model as just the beginning, but that there is something that links sort of a genealogy of Black form from that place to the future, or sort of, as we look at the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we hope that some of these questions start to become answered, so to speak.
I think you'll find that what you're saying is very much in line with what's going to be happening in the building. It's not trying to. I think what I'm deeply scared of is a sort of slightly the moment when a cliche starts to appear in architecture. I am deeply worried about cliches, because I think you simplify things, so I think that there's a kind of an ability to have a narrative that can encompass the entire thing. I don't think the experience needs to be reductive to one moment. And I think actually I don't really believe in any source point of some great eminence of something. I think it's a little bit of a fiction. There are many things that play into these kind of scenarios, and I think that has to be encompassed. And I think what you want to do is you want to make a narrative that's expansive enough to allow people to then open up other narratives. The idea is not to somehow have one singular system that is so closed that there's nothing else but one interpretation. It's actually richer for it to be loose enough and encompassing enough to allow many modernities to emanate from it. One which might be your one, and one which might be another one.
Is that not the problem of narrative? Because when you select a narrative, something is included and something is excluded. It's also the problem of representation, because representation presupposes a certain kind of image. So, I mean, I think what's brilliant about the Mobile Museum in Detroit is that it was not about an image, or was not about a kind of narrative of what African American life is. It was really about the practice of this mobile museum going around from community to community to community. And so perhaps the deficiency of architecture is that architecture is always striving for an image. It's always striving for a representation, or it's always striving for that narrative, and not necessarily, I mean, I like what the young man said here, the kind of multivalencies, the ambiguity, which suggests really a kind of a contemporaneous quality, not necessarily something to be read as past, or even something to be read as present, but something that would be read as now, as current. And Mabel, maybe you can sort of speak to the way in which these Negro buildings dealt with issues of representation other than the Dubois Egyptian temple. Or David was nodding, so maybe David wants to take that.
And I don't, I mean, maybe Saidiya could have something to say about narrative and representation, given what she
Yeah, I mean, you know.
And also trauma.
Narrative is difficult in architecture, you're right, but it's almost unescapable, but it's very difficult in architecture, because you're right, it excludes. I mean, the minute you say one thing, you're excluding the other thing.
Except in the novel, that's a narrative, but it still allows for the perspective of multiple characters, right? I mean, so there's entanglement. So it's not as if, you know, a single narrative, you know, presupposes the exclusion of other narratives. And I think that part, I would say, of, you know, what's groundbreaking about a text of Du Bois's like Black Reconstruction is precisely, it is a narrative of entanglement, that we can't understand American democracy without understanding slavery, right? We can't understand the mobilization of working class history, or the failure of mobilization, without thinking about racism and unionization. So I guess what's kind of paradoxical is that when we're thinking about this, you know, major national museum of kind of, you know, African American history and culture, how afraid we still are to, you know, to just actually to think about how racism is structuring our present, right? So I guess that's something that, you know, just gives me a bit of concern, because when we look just like at our present and we think about the forms of inequalities of wealth, and also the kind of, you know, intensity of social segregation in the U.S. today, we're experiencing more kind of racial segregation than in the period of the 60s. That so when we keep periodizing something as a trauma of the past, it makes me suspicious of the role of the museum in kind of in its engagement with the now, right? In its engagement with the history of the present, in terms of how it's mobilizing social questions and how it sets about not so much answering them, but articulating interesting and difficult questions and staging an encounter with the viewer, not through, you know, cliches of confrontation, but through a range of formal strategies that defamiliarize what we take for granted. So,
beautifully said.
Yeah, and I just, for an example, and I think this is a really important one, it's part of the reason I wanted to do or what I feel is an important outcome of the book, is to precisely remind people who are considering the National Museum, is that those institutions of the past were all about the formation and relationships of those people who were making those institutions. And in fact, the building was somewhat secondary to the struggle that they constantly had to contend with in the making of those institutions and how they were displaying, which made what they were doing even more valuable and robust and valued, I think. And an example, I think, to go back maybe to the African burial ground, and I know some of the problems with the burial ground, I think it has an absolutely stunning memorial, but what has been foreclosed are the people, right? Because there was an extraordinary struggle to actually even claim that site, right? And now there's an object, but the people are now somehow outside. And I felt that a much stronger strategy for memorializing that site would have recognized the struggle of the people and included that somehow continually in a relationship back to that site. And now they're trying to figure out how to bring people to the site. And had they not neglected that as part of it, the fact that you now have to construct a memory because the site had been forgotten, I think it would have had a very different outcome. So it has a beautiful piece of architecture, but really nobody can remember what it's for. And yet, those people who were engaged in actually making it really were the people who, I think, engaged the site the most. I think we have one more question as well.
Get me a little bit into trouble.
And this will be the last question.
Yeah, it goes back to some comments that came before about whether there is a black architecture, that there's black music, and this, and I think it's in some ways it's a badly framed question to begin with, because there's not a white architecture either that we could solidly stand behind in any way. And I don't think of black music. I think of hip hop, or I think of jazz, or I think of it in very specific ways. So when you do think of places in this country where black people live, there's definitely an architecture associated with it, whether it's the Shotgun House in New Orleans, or whether it's the housing projects in wherever, all over the country, and that it might not be about black people making architecture for themselves, but there is an architecture that has come out of segregation and racism and whatever you want to call it, and I think we can characterize it very, very clearly. So I don't know where it goes in terms of the conversation that the arguments that were happening there, but I think that you can be very specific about contextualizing certain architectures, and that they do have race involved in them.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say that given the pervasiveness of race and modernity, all architecture is somehow racialized some way. Yeah, I mean, within that, it's somehow racialized. And I do think Saidiya's comment about contemporary trauma is also really kind of critical, because one of the things that I tried to hint at also in the epilogue, actually, about the DC Museum is precisely the history of the emergence of the new right, the disenfranchisement of often what had been the backbone of the construction of the black middle class, which was in the government sector. So you shrink government, you're actually putting precisely those people who are able to use that work as a foothold into so-called upward mobility. And that is still, as I said in my opening comment, race still continues. I mean, the racism is still continuing. It has now reworked itself into some form that may not work with the old tropes that we're familiar with, in fact. So I just want to thank an extraordinary panel for taking time out of their busy schedule, and thank you.